I'm coming at this election from a different vantage point, I guess, to most of you. Your concerns are marketing, branding. My background is in political science. My background is in constructing all sorts of semi-mathematical models that attempt, usually very badly, to predict who's going to win a particular election. And indeed, we've had to junk a lot of our original ideas. We had all sorts of models that said, well, the election outcome's going to be determined by the state of the economy. If you look at the growth rate in the third quarter, that will tell you who wins. Or you look at the unemployment rate in August and September, that's going to tell you who wins. And then you've got other people who say, well, no, it's not determined by that, it's determined by a number of variables. If you're an incumbent, if you're already doing the job as president, you've got a heck of an advantage. OK, Jimmy Carter back in the 1970s, Bush Senior, George H.W. Bush, they didn't get a second term. But most presidents, most of the time, even if they've had a fairly disappointing 4 years, they get re-elected. Ronald Reagan got re-elected. Bush Jr., Bush 43, George H.W. Bush got re-elected. Richard Nixon got re-elected, although of course he had to resign a couple of years later. So if you're the incumbent, you're already doing the job, you're pretty well placed, unless things go really badly, to get re-elected. We've also said, and this was established wisdom amongst myself and my colleagues in political science, that certain things don't matter. Election, these televised debates, first one in 1960, then a bit of a gap, and then they started again in 1976. Gerald Ford versus Jimmy Carter. Election debates said they don't matter. They don't matter because nearly everybody's made up their mind, so we don't need to take any notice of them. And if you live in Europe, you don't need to stay up to watch them. But we've been proved wrong. Indeed, we've been proved wrong this time around on a whole number of things that we regarded as certainties. So the last few weeks, and certainly this next coming week, we're going to be thinking again about quite a lot of the things we regard as certainties. The question, very obviously, I usually get is, well, yeah, cut through all that, who's going to win? And, of course, the answer is, I don't have a clue. No idea. What I can say is that, in part, it's going to depend on the system and the way in which the system plays out. I don't know if any of you follow US politics that closely, or if many of you are particularly familiar with Article 2 of the US Constitution, as written in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. The problem is, what happens next Tuesday is in very large part determined by what a handful of men did in a few small, smelly rooms back in that long, hot summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. Because when they wrote Article 2 of the Constitution, that still governs the US today, they set up the Electoral College. Now, normally, one thinks of voting as being a fairly straightforward process, particularly perhaps, I guess, if you come from Denmark, where you've got a highly proportional electoral system. Basically, the share of the votes a party gets will be translated into the share of the MPs, share of the constituencies that it gets in terms of its parliamentary representation. So the American system, if you come from a Danish background, appears deeply, deeply weird. It doesn't appear quite so weird if you're British, because we've got a fairly odd electoral system, at least for elections to the House of Commons, that again can produce some odd results. But the American system can produce some even odder results. Because, as you probably know, it's not a simple matter of our American voting, adding up the votes, and then the person with the most votes wins. In practice, what happens next Tuesday night and what happens next Wednesday morning is going to be determined by this map. You'll see, attached to each of the states, a number. Unfortunately, the states aren't, for the most part, marked. Over here, California, 55. Over there, you'll see a 3, that's Wyoming, 3 for Wyoming. 29 for Florida, 38 for Texas. Now these are what are called electoral college votes, because Article 2 of the Constitution set up something called the Electoral College so that people don't vote directly, but they vote indirectly. The reason they did that in 1787 was that different states, and they were all very, very different places, had different ways of choosing who they wanted as president, who they were going to back. In some states, they were very enlightened and gave a few women the vote fairly early on. Yeah, certainly most states wouldn't dream of giving African Americans the vote. All that came later. But they had different rules and regulations for who had the vote, and therefore they had to work out a compromise system which didn't involve direct elections. So they came up with this. And the way it works is it's tied to your representation in Congress, in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And the way you get that 55 for California is that California at the moment has 53 members of the House of Representatives, 2 members of the Senate. Add 53 and 2 together, you get 55, which is what it gets in terms of what are called electoral votes. That formula doesn't need to worry us too much. All we need to bear in mind is those numbers are related to a state's population. California is the most populous state in the US. It's got the most people. Therefore, it gets the most electoral votes. Wyoming is the least populous state in the US. More or less nobody lives there except former President Dick Cheney and the guys from Brokeback Mountain. So it only gets 3 electoral college votes. Now, take my word for it. You add that lot together and you get 538. All that together, 538. That's what you get for the 50 states, plus the District of Columbia. Washington, D.C., which is not a state, gets 3 electoral college votes. Now that means, under the terms of the Constitution, to win the presidency next week, either Mr. Romney or Mr. Obama, they simply have to get more than half of those 538 votes, which comes to 270. 270 is the magic figure one of them has got to get to become president. And the aim of the game is to get those 270. Now, because of demographics, you can be reasonably sure, in fact more than reasonably sure, totally confident, who's going to win some of those states. We know, and I would stake a lifetime salary on this, that Barack Obama will get more votes than Mitt Romney, and therefore he's going to get all 55 of those electoral votes from California. Because the way it works is in nearly every state, there's a couple of states which for peculiar reasons do it differently, but nearly every state, one candidate has just got to get more votes amongst the people than the other guy, and then he gets all of that state's electoral college votes. So Barack Obama just has to get 1 more vote than Mitt Romney in California, and all those 55 are his, which puts him well on the way to the magic figure of 270. Likewise, if I can be sure of anything, I can be sure that Mr. Romney will get more votes than Mr. Obama in the Lone Star State of Texas. And therefore, all those 38 electoral college votes will go to Mitt Romney. So the election is not about Texas, it's not about California. If Mr. Obama and Mr. Romney have bothered going to California or Texas, it will have simply been to get some cash. That is really the only reason going, and also it looks a little bit discourteous to ignore Texas or ignore California. So you have to go there occasionally. But generally speaking, you don't bother with the certainties. Neither candidate, because Mr. Obama's sure of it and Mr. Romney knows he hasn't got a chance, Neither candidate's going to go to the Empire State, New York. No point. Maybe you need to be seen there at the moment because of the hurricane, but that's about it. So there's no point in going to New York. We know New York is going to go for Mr. Obama. Indeed, we know almost the whole of New England, with the possible exception of New Hampshire, is going to go for Mr. Obama. We also know that if you take these states that form a kind of letter L, coming down the middle here and then across the deep south, states like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, we know they're all going to go for Mr. Romney. They've only got a limited number of electoral college votes. Anyway, there's very little point in bothering with them. So this whole election is about, pretty obviously, the states in grey. What is going to happen in Florida? What is going to happen in Virginia? What is going to happen above all else in the state of Ohio? These states are much more evenly divided. Why? Again, largely because of demographics. There are certain groups that always tend to lean Democratic. African Americans. 9 out of 10, more than 9 out of 10 African Americans who cast a vote, vote Democrat. Latinos, 7 out of 10 Latinos who cast a vote or have a vote, vote Democrat. Young people, i.e. the 18 to 29-year-olds, those who cast a vote, probably at least 6 out of 10 will vote Democrat. On the other side, if we take whites, particularly white men, because there's a gender gap, if we take those who are regular churchgoers, which of course is a very big deal in the United States, particularly those who are evangelicals, as opposed to regular mainstream, mainline Protestant denominations, they are almost certain to vote Republican. And the balance of demographics in any particular state will determine the kind of outcome, broadly speaking. Except, although demographics provide 80% of the answer, they don't provide the remaining 20%. Now, the remaining 20% comes down to the unknowns and why I, like everybody else, doesn't have a clue what's going to happen next week. The two unknowns, first of all, and we didn't really appreciate this properly until that first debate when Barack Obama did so disappointingly for his supporters. There's more people in the middle than we appreciated. It's been established wisdom amongst political scientists, another thing that we've got wrong, that Americans are heavily polarised. They're split between Republicans and Democrats, between conservatives and people on the left, and there's not much middle ground left. Everybody's got a pretty fixed opinion. And we forgot there's still a sliver, 6, 7, 8% in the middle, who can flip around. And amongst the Democrats, there's probably a further 5, 6, 7%, again, who could be quite easily tipped the other way. Maybe amongst the Republicans, also another 5, 6, 7% who could be turned back. So there's probably about 15% of people to play for. But even more importantly than that, there's the issue of turnout. Now, turnout is not a big deal for strategists in Denmark. Because you've got very high levels of turnout at elections, it's actually very difficult to get them up much further. If you've got a turnout of 88, 89%, getting an extra 1, getting it up to 90, 91, 92% is quite difficult. If turnout is much lower than that, and it is in the United States, it's not quite as low as it looks, but it's pretty low, it's that much easier to get an extra 5, 10, maybe 15% voting. And it comes down to those turnout figures. 2008, 4 years ago, when Barack Obama won that famous victory, he won it because you've got particularly high levels of turnout amongst certain groups that lean Democratic. Particularly high levels of turnout amongst African Americans. particularly high levels of turnout amongst young people, particularly high levels of turnout amongst Latinos. Those groups that lean Democratic turned out big time for Barack Obama 4 years ago, inspired by the messages of change and hope and all the rest of that, what Governor Sarah Palin, former Alaska governor, called the hopey, changey stuff. And then on the other side, many Republicans, despite Governor Palin's presence on the ticket as vice presidential candidate, were not wildly inspired by Senator John McCain. They respected him, they had a certain amount of time for them, but he didn't really reach the parts that other politicians could reach. And because of that, you've got a lower level of turnout than usual on the Republican side. Now this time around, it's different. Those groups who were really inspired last time around, it's unclear how far they will turn out. If you speak to any Democratic Party strategist, he or she will say we've got a fantastic get out the vote operation. We will get these people out on the day, we've got them out to vote already. But I'm not sure if I believe that. It's not just enough to have a good operation. You've got to have motivation there in the first place. And I'm not convinced it exists 4 years on. Last time around, Barack Obama hoped change, America was going to be different amidst an economic crisis. We just had 8 years of George W. Bush. We had 2 unpopular wars. This time around, what does the Obama campaign slogan come down to? Forward. One of the reasons I think Barack Obama had so many difficulties in that first election debate was that up until then, the election campaign, the Democrats' election campaign, had been very, very largely negative. Vote Democrat because Mitt Romney's awful. Vote Democrat because these Republicans are just a shower representing the rich. They're off in their own crazy interests. And because it was an entirely negative message, when Barack Obama was up there in the auditorium having to answer questions about what he would do in a second 4-year term, he found those sort of questions very, very difficult to answer indeed. And Mitt Romney, who perhaps arguably didn't put in that good a performance, still appeared great by comparison. So the election next week is going to be about turnout more than anything else, and then that handful of people in the middle in a relatively small number of states. If you stay up for the election results, obviously it's the East Coast results we're going to be getting first. We don't actually have, by a curious quirk of the US system, the official results don't actually come till January. But, as you probably know from last time around, the networks, the television networks, CNN, Fox News, and the rest of them, they, at a certain point, will call a particular state. To call a particular state means they've reached a point that they are confident of the result. They are confident that a particular state will go for a particular candidate. So they call that state. We call Florida for Mr. Romney, or whatever it might be. And generally, that system, even though it's completely unofficial, by which the TV networks declare who the winner is, and then eventually at some point early in the morning, the loser rings up the victor and says congratulations, normally that system works rather well. There was a problem 12 years ago. And that problem, you probably recall, focused on the state of Florida. The TV networks, and I suppose I shouldn't be bashing CNN here, the TV networks, including, if I remember rightly, CNN, called Florida. And of course there's a bit of competition between the TV networks to call a state first, although of course they also want to be accurate. So first of all, they called Florida for Mr. Bush. Then they called Florida for Mr. Gore. Then they called Florida and said it's undecided. It then remained undecided for a month and a half. So calling states, although it's become the basis for declaring American election results, is a precarious exercise that relies on the judgment and intuition of a handful of people in a handful of television networks. But that is the way it works. That is the way it will work next week. we will be hanging on. We'll be hanging on for Florida. We'll be hanging on for Virginia. And above all else, we'll be hanging on for Ohio. We can be reasonably certain that whoever wins Ohio is going to be the next president of the United States. But if it's not decided in Ohio, it'll be decided in Colorado. Okay, let me pause for a while. We can look ahead to the next 4 years, but this is probably a good place to just stop for a few minutes. Questions, comments, thoughts?
Just a question about, you said the TV networks are pretty much deciding not deciding the outcome, but predicting the outcome. What happened, say, 40, 50 years ago in that same situation?
Yeah, I mean, the radio networks were to some extent playing the part. I mean, in practice, we weren't getting the results for a heck of a lot later because, strictly speaking, the way the system works is the state governor or the state legislature, it varies from state to state, will collect in the results. He or she will then send a message to Washington, D.C. saying what the results are. The results will then be formally read out in Congress on January the 5th or January the 6th, and they will then declare a victor. I mean, generally speaking, if we go back to earlier elections, with some notable exceptions, they weren't nearly as close as what we're dealing with today. So it was pretty clear that there was one particular election victor. But they had a fallback. And the fallback was until 1936-37, the president who was elected in November, the president by law is elected on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. The president was elected in November but didn't take office till March. So Franklin Roosevelt, elected November 1932, did not enter the White House until March 1933. So you allow yourself 4 months to sort out those kind of communications issues. And obviously, in many cases, people weren't hearing the results for several weeks. Yeah?
As a follow-up question to that, so can the networks, can they call out the state before the election is closed?
There's been a lot of controversy about that because in some earlier years they were doing that. In fact, they were calling the result for the whole of the US before the West Coast had finished voting. And that created a lot of problems. So now it's an absolute rule that all the networks follow that you do not call results until everybody's finished voting. But if you stayed up last time in 2008, Wolf Blitzer from CNN, the moment they'd finished voting on the West Coast, he called, because you then move from calling a state to calling the election, he called the election for Barack Obama before they counted a single vote in these West Coast Pacific Time states, because we were so confident, they were so confident, rightly, that they would go to the Democrats and seal Obama's victory. So the election was called, not before they'd finished voting, but before, certainly long before all the votes had been counted. You have an additional complication, which is in some states, they are in different time zones within the state. So if you take Florida, the west of Florida here, around Tallahassee, that's on Central Time, whereas this is on East Coast Time. Part of Ohio, I think, I can't remember, I want to check. I think a little bit of Ohio is on Central Time, not East Coast Time, which will delay any results we get and make an even longer night than it would be otherwise. Yeah?
In some of the undecided states, the vote is quite evenly divided. It doesn't take a whole lot of votes to make it turn from the left to the right party. Has there ever been a presidency or a president candidate who's tried to make people move to that state well ahead of the election going on? Instead of changing people's minds, just make a political movement, literally.
Well, everybody does it with students.
Yeah.
Do students vote where they're at college, or do they vote in their home state? Now that's going to be a calculation that each party strategist is going to make.
And if Obama is so certain of California, why doesn't he get a whole lot of Californians to move to Florida? I mean, they're quite good at raising political movements, so why don't they do it liberally?
I'm not sure about literally quite how that would work out. I mean, certainly if you've got volunteers, activists, I mean, you tell them, don't waste your time in California. You get out there. On the phone banks, you know, you're being called in Florida. You could well be being called from California. So, I mean, I think the movement that's going on, I mean, apart from students, no, I don't think people have really thought in terms of the physical movement of people, but I get, actually there was one exception, and that's the state of New Hampshire, this grey one up here. Anyone been to New Hampshire? Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of an oddity in terms of New England. Because most of New England we associate with American liberalism. Places like Massachusetts and Vermont kind of lean to the left rather nicely. You go to Burlington, Vermont, and it's lots of nice ice cream and coffee houses and independent cinemas and sort of lots of muesli. And but New Hampshire is very different because that's got a much more of a libertarian, perhaps right-leaning ethos. You probably saw the car number plates when you were in New Hampshire. Okay, car number plates, New Hampshire. Nearly all US car number plates, you've got a little motto or slogan from the state. So New York, the Empire State. Vermont, Green Mountain State. New Mexico, Land of Enchantment. On New Hampshire car number plates, you have live free or die. Which sums up the sort of rather different ethos of New Hampshire. It's got a more right-wing ethos, and there was, at one point, I think about 10 years ago, I can't remember, a real bid to try and get other libertarians, people on the right who value gun rights, who want to limit government as much as possible, to get them to move to New Hampshire so they would have an absolute cast-iron libertarian majority where they could live free or die together.
2 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think the hurricane will have any impact on building in America?
Don't know. I was, yesterday, because I think somebody asked a similar question yesterday. Yesterday I said no, which is probably a rather rash thing to say. And I said no because I think generally political narratives take a while to establish themselves. They take longer than a week. If we think back to Hurricane Katrina, which hit New Orleans in 2005. I mean, first of all, it wasn't clear what had happened in terms of the levees breaking and it wasn't clear just how dramatic and large scale the disaster was until some time after the initial crisis had started. And then it wasn't clear for a few days after that just how inadequate the federal and local government efforts were. And it wasn't some time after that until the narrative of government failure really established itself. So what I said yesterday was that that kind of narrative's not really going to develop in the space of a week. But just looking at the TV coverage today, and in particular looking at Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey, who's been very positive towards Barack Obama, very respectful indeed, whereas Chris Christie is a bastion of the Republican Party, and it's been odd a week before an election being quite so nice about the president, a Democratic president, but he has been, and Barack Obama's been seen more or less hand in hand with Christie touring some of the disaster zones. Now that may have some sort of impact, I don't know. It's certainly showing the president in command, it's showing the president working across the party lines. So that may have some sort of impact. If it doesn't have an impact on opinion, it may have an impact on Governor Christie's political career. Without being too cynical, Governor Christie's political career rather depends on Mitt Romney not being elected, so that in 4 years' time, Governor Christie might make a bid for the Republican presidential nomination. But it would probably take somebody more cynical than me to suggest that.
All right,
Okay.
let's give Edward a big hand.